Gas prices are climbing. The Strait of Hormuz is under threat. And Washington is now arguing whether President Trump can restart the war powers clock via some sort of semi legal doublespeak. Then Senator Lindsey Graham dies. His sister will fill out his term, but she cannot inherit his seniority, his committee muscle, or his ability to make escalation sound rather routine within the Republican Party. So, this is really not two stories we're going to talk about today. It's really one story about power. Who gets to start a war? Who pays for it? And what happens when one of the people keeping the machinery moving suddenly disappears? This is Liberty Lens, and let's get into it this episode with none other than my friend, co-host, and current contender for the VP nomination of the Republican Party, Mr. Mike Termott. And Mike, before we start, give me a very quick 5-minute recap of the exciting announcement at FreedomFest last week where you announced your candidacy for the vice presidential nomination of the Republican Party.
Appreciate that, and I always enjoy how you open these episodes, John. I did not see that coming. I thought you were going to open up with Senator Graham. We'll get to him in a moment. I didn't know you were going to ask me about Freedom Fest, but of all the things that should be easy to answer, I just got back a few days ago. A wonderful experience. Freedom Fest is a fun event. I have to admit that one of the differences between Freedom Fest and other events is that it, in my view, hits the right mix between fun and policy. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. I guess I better not name names, but I've been recently. I've been to both political on one side, and events, and policy conventions on the other. And each one lacks a little bit of what Freedom Fest brings to bear. It's a lot of fun, and everyone is into the liberty movement. Yada 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 yada. We had a great experience. We had 1,000 people in the room for our announcement that we're seeking the Republican Party's nomination for vice president. Extremely well received. Everyone loves the idea. Couple people, came up and want to help, which is awfully sweet and wonderful. That will bring a tear to your eye. And did, I guess, 8 podcasts while we were there, and signed up for a couple more. So that's kind of fun, as long as people are interested. Saw your friend and mine, Austin Peterson, out there, did an interview with him and a bunch of other fun people. Matt Kibbe told me to get my ass to Washington. We'll do his show in a few weeks. So looking forward to that. Bumped into Lisa Kennedy, a.k.a. Kennedy. It occurred to me, I didn't bring this up with her. I had never met her in person before.
Oh.
It occurred to me, she has a nice name. Lisa's a nice name. I guess, coming from someone named Mike or John. We're not huge critics of people's first names, right? And
right.
Lisa is every bit as, unusual as Mike and John. But it's, certainly not offensive enough that I would leave it behind. So next time I see her, I got to ask her, what's with going with just one name, right?
Maybe it's a leftover from our MTV days, from the Cher.
I think it definitely is. I just don't know, what motivated that. But, good for her. So anyway, bumped into her. And my big line for whom I will call Ms. Kennedy was, hi, my wife's a big fan. And this was easy. I was totally unprepared. I just bumped into her behind the stage because she was sort of the MC for the session. And I didn't know what else to say, hi, So I said, my wife's a big fan. And it was funny. We both laughed because the implication sort of was I'm not. And I didn't mean it like that at all. I just literally meant, Nancy's a big fan and has been since the music days, as you say. So completely unrelatedly, a half an hour later, we're in the hallway. There's no one else in the hallway but the three of us. I'm walking with my wife, Nancy, and here comes Ms. Kennedy the other direction. And, hi. Oh, by the way, this is my wife. And she's like, oh, this is the one who's a big fan. And okay, that would be uninteresting, and was. But then the two of them sat down, and Kennedy says this: "Let's pretend we are best friends." Again, we all laugh because the implication is we're not, right? And the two of them start hugging for the camera. It was a socially awkward moment of the highest order. And I was there to take every picture, which I will share with you and no one else. But it was quite funny. And that's sort of the nature of Freedom Fest, is you get a bunch of people who really are important and influential, and then you get a group of people who really are smart and policy familiar and well trained, and you bring them all together, you throw them into the blender, and you hit go. And 4 days later, after everyone has had enough fun and exhaustion and alcohol, everyone's friends, and you go home and you forget each other. So, looking forward to doing that next year.
Absolutely. Maybe it'll give you some time to work on your lady skills. Like
Yeah, I'm
look
really,
to the ladies.
yeah, I'm not good at this.
Well, fortunately, there's room for improvement. You did all you had to do with Mrs. Termott, so that's the key. That's the key point there. That's the only person you have to impress in terms of that. But anyway, let's get going to the main topic, which is the Iran war started up again, Mike. Uh, I hate to say I told you so, but when the ceasefire was announced, when we did the episode, I said, Mike, I think this is just a ploy for the markets.
Yeah,
And within a month, we'll be back at it. And
yeah.
unfortunately, I think I might have hit that one on the head.
You
So
absolutely hit it on the head. I think uh, a lot of folks recognize at the time that you were right, right? Unfortunately for the markets and the enthusiastically optimistic, not everyone, but people that were paying close attention knew you were right at the time.
it's interesting. There's a couple of see the reason we started off with the war again, and we'll talk about Senator Graham's passing. I think as we get into the conversation is because and I hate to put it in this way because it sounds almost cold, but it's not just the war. It's everything that's intertwined with it on the geopolitical stage, right? So it's the actual death and destruction being caused by the war, which is in itself a
Huge and terrible.
huge and terrible calamity. We don't want to underplay that. But then you also have the repercussions in the economy, in politics, both domestic and international,
Yeah,
and the future far ranging far beyond when this conflict actually resolves itself, the
yep,
remnants, right? Like
yep,
whether it's monetary order or something of that order. So
yep,
Mike, let's start off with this. Um, the first thing I want to say is the hostilities did start. The U.S. hit Iranian targets.
yep.
The president said he will continue to do so unless
Military and economic.
military and economic, much
Things like rail, which normally the United States DoD avoids because international law suggests, we don't touch what should be characterized as domestic economic assets. The bar that should be the bar that legally has to be cleared and that should be cleared is, does it represent an imminent and direct asset for military objectives of your adversary?
right. So there's been an escalation. Iran, of course, has made closes the strait. Now the president has announced the U.S. will re-implement the blockade and charge a 20% toll.
Yep,
Again, the president, whether you view it as a plus or a minus, is always looking to cut a deal of some sort,
it's a
and
minus.
I would tend to agree with you.
Right.
Uh,
Just thought I'd, save us the ambiguity. It's a
fair,
minus.
fair enough. So Mike, before we continue into the political, because I think there is a key issue to discuss there. Give me your thoughts on the hostilities resuming,
Yeah.
the ceasefire crumbling. Go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The MOU was always just that, a memorandum of understanding, and it was largely one sided. There were many indications that the Iranians, as complex as their governing structure is, right, the Iranians were not fully on board. It was more, as a practical matter, it came off as a statement of what the United States wishes were true. The Iranians had some people sign off on it, but Iranian governance is presents as more complex than it truly is. The IRGC calls the shots, and the IRGC was not signing. It was people, that they could plausibly deny or throw off of buildings, or some combination of the two. And so they always had a certain arm's length deniability. And this is one of the reasons why the Iranians are so difficult with whom to negotiate, because you never really know the level of sincerity and commitment to following through. Or, put differently, you can pretty much expect that they're not being sincere and don't have a lot of commitment to follow through. So no one should be surprised. One of the reasons why you predicted this would fall apart is because you thought that the administration wasn't either serious about achieving certain things or underestimating the difficulty of achieving certain things, right? And so it's just signaling for the sake of markets that we think / aka hope that things are going to be okay. And the same thing can be said on the Iranian side. They just weren't sincere. So for all these reasons, no one is shocked that it fell apart. John, one of the things that we need to say from time to time is that the war is horrible. It's not true that fewer than 20 lives have been lost. It is true that fewer than 20 American lives have been lost. Thank God. Thank God. On the other hand, losing, where are we at, 14? I apologize for not knowing that number exactly. That's a lot of people. 14 American deaths is significant. The other thing that needs to be said is that there have been thousands of Iranian lives lost. And yes, it is the job of the Defense Department of the United States to not value those one for one equal to American lives. I get that. But that does not mean that we, as people of good faith, as mutual inhabitants of the community that we refer to as God's children, right? We are fellow human beings, and we do value lives that are not American lives with huge value, right?
We would hope. We would hope.
So, yes. Well, I mean, you and me.
Yeah.
When I say we, I mean, never mind the government just for a moment. Persons who are of good faith, which I believe are virtually all humans, human beings, we value each other's lives. If to make up a weird scenario, if you and I were in Iran and we had the opportunity to save someone's life and that person was an Iranian, you would do anything to do so. And so I just want to say that it is important, for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, that we end this war, prevent escalation, prevent these sorts of things from happening again. And those reasons must include preventing the loss of life, because the urgency to prevent the loss of life, is an accurate reflection of our ethics as Americans. And a foreign policy must, to be legitimate, reflect the underlying ethics of the population.
I agree, Mike. And I think the reason what you're saying is especially striking is that, again, this was a war of choice and a war in some ways of convenience. It wasn't a war of imminent threat. It wasn't a war of American lives being at stake. So if you're going to conduct this war, this type of war, I think what you said has to be, if not one of the guiding principle, right? Because otherwise you are no better than, for the sake of argument, the other side of the Cold War that the U.S. was always,
Yeah, any other group, right?
or any
Any
other
other
group.
group.
So
It's interesting. We had, I'm sorry for the excursion, but I think that let me see if I can do this analogy in 40 seconds. I was asked at FreedomFest whether Truman had done the right thing by dropping the bombs, right? And one of the things that has to be said is that he thought, we can all, historians should debate more than economists and financiers and technicians like you and me, but historians should debate whether or not he was correct. But he perceived that he would actually save lives net by dropping the bombs and avoiding a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland.
Right.
Now, we don't know if he was right or wrong. Probably to this day, we don't know whether he was right or wrong. Certainly at the time,
Not
it
as
was
clear.
a guess.
Yeah, it's not as clear cut a question as we as children perhaps were led to believe, right? Because everything we were
Right,
taught in school was in order to save hundreds of thousands of American lives for an invasion of Japan, the decision was made. There were a lot of
right.
other political decisions involved as well, right? It was not just American lives, Japanese lives as well. It has to be taken into consideration. The keeping of communism at bay, because people forget we dropped those 2 atomic bombs on Japan, but we also led the Kremlin to believe that we had a stockpile of them that we were willing to use on Moscow as well. And that kept things at bay for many years, even though the truth is
And the long run implication was that the other major powers realized they had to get nukes too.
there. So
So it's
it's
complicated.
super
It's extremely complicated. And merely the point I want to make is that we're going to say, I'm going to say, and I suspect you are too, some fairly critical things of the way the administration has managed this. Having said that, I recognize that this is a war that may have been difficult, possibly even impossible to avoid in the long run. If the Iranians were always going to pursue nuclear weapons and not legitimately bargain them away, if they were always going to say that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, if they're always going to continue funding, not with millions, but with billions of dollars, terrorist groups around the world, if they were going to say, as a matter of doctrine, that the United States is evil, if if they're going to maintain the conventional power to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, if they're going to deal with our adversaries and withstand economic sanctions, if they're going to reserve to themselves the capability, the right, and the political will to kill thousands, some say tens of thousands, some say as many as 40,000 of their own citizens who are merely engaged in protest. Having said all that, that's a hard war to avoid, right?
Yeah, and you know what though? As you were saying that, I know you're a trained economist, as we like to say. Uh, I occasionally have said that I'm a trained data scientist, and when I keep hearing all those ifs, all I see in my brain is a long Markov chain where by the time you start your conditionals and by the time you get to the last one, the probability of the whole chain occurring shrinks, right? So while I appreciate what you're saying, which is had all these conditions been met, or had they occurred rather, war may have been unavoidable. I grant you that. But then
Yeah,
at any point along the way, I would argue, well, the chance of the next step in the chain occurring diminishes with every step. So
sure. And that's why you go after every one of those links in the hope of breaking that chain. But having said that, all those things are in place today and have been for a long while. So I just share that as we need to temper our criticism. What bothers me is not that we got into this war per se. What bothers me is how and when and why, with whom, or should I say, without whom and with whom, all of that was done wrong.
and that's a great segue into what I wanted to discuss as the next thing, right? So even if I grant you that President Trump thought there was an imminent danger that allowed him that would have constitutionally allowed him to act for a certain window of time.
And he didn't. I can't grant that. But
I
okay.
don't either, but
But if we grant it for a
if we
moment,
grant it for a moment that he had some sort of information that the rest of us were never privy to, which is always the excuse of an executive.
he didn't.
He didn't. But even if I allow that, I will allow it, let's say for the moment, for the case of this argument. The point is, can he talk his way into an extension of his war powers? By that I mean, Congress have already had non-binding resolutions that said this has got to stop. We now have to approve everything. Of course, that would never pass because the president would veto that if there was a law. To the extent that the War Powers Act limits him to 60 days without congressional authorization, the president seems to think, and this is another reason why a lot of people said he announced a quote ceasefire when none of us actually believed that would be the case, is because in his mind, he's arguing if he called the ceasefire, that ended that conflict and starts the 60-day clock again. This is what I'm hearing. And look, Mike, you and I have discussed this. The president seems to relish, and his advisors seem to relish in figuring out ways to ignore the Constitution until every last avenue has been exhausted. And that includes even after the Supreme Court has ruled against you, as we found out with his birthright citizenship, he intends to appeal to the Supreme Court, which quite honestly, I've never heard of in my lifetime and has only rarely happened. So we understand that the president relishes this sort of thing. So, Mike, talk to me about that. Do you think by him unilaterally claiming a ceasefire and then unilaterally saying it's off, let's start the clock again, is this a reasonable interpretation of the law of the Constitution? Is it a reasonable expectation of our president? What's going on?
It depends on your definition of these terms. Is it reasonable? In court, a court would say that is not reasonable. Politically speaking, is it reasonable? And reasonability resides in the mind of the voter, politically speaking, right? It doesn't have to be actually reasonable. It doesn't have to be 2 and 2 is 4 reasonable. It doesn't even have to be logical. It doesn't have to be legal. And it isn't. It's not logical. It's not legal. We'll get into the legality. But in a political context, which it turns out is the only context that matters, it only has to appeal to the reasonability of the voters who support the legislators who allow this. And for these purposes, it's enough because the president and, for the most part, people in the administration other than the president are able to go to microphones and assert it. And a lot of people, quite reasonably, accept it as likely to be true, right? Why would the administration lie to us? Well, the reason the administration is lying to you is because they know they can get away with it, and they're motivated to do so because they want to prosecute this war, because they want to be able to get out of it, and they don't want to run the risk that they're going to get cut short. Because let's face it, if they get cut short now, where the war is now is on the losing side of the ledger for the United States, right? We're underwater. We're further behind where we were, further behind than where we were before the war started. We're in a worse position today than when the war started, without a doubt. Thousands of lives lost, hundreds of billions of dollars lost. The Iranian government has learned that they can withstand. They've been lionized. They've been able to demonstrate they can close the Strait of Hormuz without too much bad things happening to them that they cannot withstand. We're in a much worse position than ever before. Oil is expensive. Oil spiked again today on word that the president yesterday wants to impose a toll. By the way, he then reversed it just an hour ago and said that you almost can't make this up, except that you probably could. He reversed and said that the Gulf states are going to be investing in the United States, and therefore he's going to stand down in this idea of charging a toll in the Strait of
Well,
Hormuz.
that's just more nonsense. All these deals that get announced that never materialize. And Mike, just to tag on to what you
Even if they did, you're right. And even if they did, what does that have to do with,
right,
you know,
but
I'm going to play by international law and not screw up the entire world economy because Bahrain is going to send 20 billion. I mean, it makes no
well,
sense.
also, I just wanted to expand a little bit on what you said, which I agree with 100%. Is I think a lot of what other people aren't talking about is the catalyst that this war was potentially for a realignment of the world economic order. I mean, a lot of people think the stock market drives world economy, but it's actually the bond markets that do that, the sovereign debt markets that do that. And the reaction to President Trump's foreign policy has been nothing short of disastrous in those markets. Like, I don't know how much you want to touch it, maybe a 30-second.
Well, there's been for a couple of extremely reasonable reasons. One is uh, American U.S. dollar denominated assets have declined in value because people don't trust the dollar as much as they used to, because they don't trust our government to stop wasting so much money, and thereby through inflation making the dollar worth less, right, in the future, as well as the risk, uh, the now non-zero risk that used to be a zero risk of the federal government being able to back up the dollar and for the dollar to maintain its unassailable position as the currency of reserve for the rest of the world and currency of transaction for the rest of the world. And so it is quite possible the demand for the dollar could diminish in the future. And if there's a financial collapse around the world, demand for the US dollar could diminish. So for all those reasons, there's decline in US currency based assets. But on top of that, there's an expectation of inflation, which would diminish the future value of these assets. And on top of that, there's a risk premium because people are afraid the war might escalate, it might get out of hand, and that could mean certain governments are stretched in terms of their own ability to make interest payments, either because they got to spend a lot of money on war or because their economy is tanked because of a war, right? So you got all those, multiple reasons for a risk premium, multiple reasons to expect inflation in the future, multiple reasons to worry about the value of the US dollar. There's at least 6 reasons right there why the bond market isn't doing well. And they all reflect some aspect of reality. These are not just the expectations of a bunch of dopes sitting around the water fountain, right? The, these are huge institutional investors who are deciding that the world is not as rosy a place to invest, especially looking 5 and 10 years out, as it was last year.
And it,
I find that wholly reasonable.
and it's not just, people keep saying China, China, China in terms of our U.S. debt, but the number one foreign holder of U.S. debt is Japan, staunch ally. The UK, I think, is either the number two or the number three holder of U.S. debt, another staunch ally. They're dumping treasuries and they are buying record amounts of gold. Now,
Yes, they are, as are U.S. investors. And by the way, just to reinforce your point, most of those Japanese and British investors, some of them are the big central banks, some of them are government entities, but a lot of them are private sector giant investment institutions. These are not dummies, right? Say what if you don't like the Central Bank of Japan, and we've all been mad at the Central Bank of Japan from time to time. If you don't like the central bank in the United Kingdom, we've all been mad at them from time to time. But the big institutional investors who are paid not to do stupid things, they are buying gold. American investors
right,
are buying gold. The one thing that we all have, even if you don't speak English, the one thing people have in common around the world is that they're buying gold instead of
right. I'll-
U.S. Treasury
yeah.
securities.
So the president, and then you tie this into Kevin Warsh's appointment at the Fed at the time. You and I both said, hey, he's a Milton Friedman guy, great choice. It doesn't seem that Mr. Warsh is executing what the president wanted done, which was an immediate cut in interest rates to goose the economy. So for all those reasons, Mike,
Mm-hmm.
this war really needed to be wrapped up. For, I
Lickety
yeah,
split.
sooner rather than later. And I know it's a glib statement, but that is the case, right? Like this war, the human cost, the economic cost, the geopolitical cost. This is a big L for the United States. If there's anybody in our government who thinks this is anything other than an L, a huge L,
Big L, bigger than I think that for which we have an appreciation around the water cooler, because now, for all the reasons you just mentioned, and the start-stop nature of it, right? It's a sign of incompetence, and it's a sign, how do I say, it doesn't look like it's going to end. When you bomb for you bomb for 3 days. Let me make up an alternative scenario with facts that don't exist. If this were an example of we bomb for a few days, we all go to the negotiating table, we come up with an MOU, we negotiate for a couple of months. That feels like, yeah, we could wrap that up. We could wrap that up. This feels like we're going to be doing a podcast on this in 2027. That's how this is starting to
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah, it's Vietnam. It's hacked to say, but it's Vietnam all over again. Maybe not in the cost of human toll, thankfully. Thank God. It's not like
Well,
yeah,
hopefully,
hopefully, but it
hopefully.
is you do get that sense of dread or
But in the first couple of years of Vietnam, you were only into thousands, not hundreds of
yeah,
thousands
yeah,
also.
yeah, but it's still
Same thing with Afghanistan and
yeah.
Iraq. We totaled a million lives lost there because of the prolonged nature.
Eh,
I'm not suggesting I have an expectation that this is going to go 10
right.
years, but it certainly doesn't feel like we're going to have this wrapped up, by Labor Day.
Well, that's the other thing. We always
We're going to be well into the political cycle for the
that was gonna be
midterm
my next
after Labor Day, and this war is still going to be going on, is how it feels. We don't know that, but that's how it feels at the moment.
like, in terms of politics domestically, do you think there's now a realization that this Iran war will not first of all, they may have the administration politically may have the sense that yeah, me, you, Mike, and John may know this is a huge loss for the U.S. regardless of the result. Right at even now at this stage, but in the eyes of the typical Trump supporters, the typical Republican supporters, we might be able to carve out a win if we present a different sort of spin on it. To wit, Stephen Miller isn't around flapping his gums as much on TV. Pete Hegseth isn't around on TV flapping his gums as much. This really does seem that they're taking a more restrained communication approach right now. There hasn't been this Pete Hegseth, we're going to kill everybody that we see. There isn't this Pete Hegseth double tap survivors type of talk anymore. Do you think that the administration is trying to put a different PR spin on this? That they're not as braggadocious outside of the president himself with his, this is easy kind of talk. Do you think there's been a concerted effort to downplay the Iran war in terms of U.S. heroics, in terms of U.S. posturing?
No, I think
No, no, I'd like to hear.
that is how it presents. Your observation is spot on. But if you're asking my opinion, is that due to a concerted, planful, operational, well communicated, well thought out, vetted process inside of the administration to do this with some adult planning? No. The, the this comes from. Have you seen the clips lately? Organizations like CNN that hate the administration per se, like Donald Trump could personally solve cancer, and CNN would run a piece on why it took him so long. So take everything with a grain of salt on CNN. But CNN is nonstop showing clips of Marco Rubio saying international law allows no one to charge a fee in the Strait of Hormuz. J.D. Vance, the United States position has always been and always will be that no one charges a toll in international waters, right? Pete Hegseth saying the same things. The reason they're quiet is because they have no idea what the hell is going to come out of their boss's mouth tomorrow, which is reasonable. Now, I always say, and I continue to believe it's true, the president has surrounded himself with dinglings. And Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance are not dinglings, but they have been positioned as such by the White House, right? They've been put in tough positions. To be fair, they have put themselves in these positions, right? You defend what the boss says, and the boss changes his mind. Whoops! It's not easy. It's not easy. And Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance are both extremely intelligent, extremely capable politicians and statesmen. That is true. But they have gotten themselves in a bad position because they have backed up some pretty dumb things coming out of the administration. And now some of those chickens are trying to roost, and it's a really bad look. And I think that's more what's going on, is that nobody wants to get out in front because nobody knows what's coming next. That's a real problem. And to your point about others standing in the way, and the legality of it. You asked earlier, was it reasonable, right? It depends on who's asking and what the context is, because there is no reasonable interpretation that this war is being prosecuted because of an imminent threat from the Iranians, right? There's no way to square that circle. You'd have to say a lot of things that just weren't true. It's not true. Now, would the Iranians have eventually attacked us? I think that's very reasonable. That is why I say, in the long run, this may be a war that was hard to avoid. We're eventually going to have this war one way or another. But can you justify legally, the administration launching this war without congressional authority? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's no way to justify it legally. That doesn't necessarily per se make it a bad idea. It just makes it illegal. If I can draw a distinction between those two things, right? They got into this in contravention of domestic law, contravention of the U.S. Constitution, and contravention of international law. They violated all three. That doesn't make it a bad idea. It just makes it damned illegal. Right. And the War Powers Act says you got to cut it out in 60 days. Right. And the War Powers Act, let me draw an analogy here, see if you like it. I haven't tried this in public yet. So if you hate it, okay, be nice. I think there's an analogy here between the War Powers Act and the Bill of Rights. In the sense that without the Bill of Rights, you and I know what the Constitution means, but there were those who at the time feared people wouldn't understand the Constitution well enough, and so needed to explain certain things. And this was a big debate at the time. You go back 230 years, there was a big debate. If we go with a Bill of Rights and enumerate, articulate certain rights, these 10 buckets of rights, would someone interpret that as meaning
those are the only rights?
Those are the only rights. And once you get outside of that, it's not so explicit, not so hardcore, because nobody pays any attention to the 10th. Nobody pays any attention to the 10th. Very few politicians can even spell 10th Amendment.
Or third.
Right? Or third. Nobody pays any attention to the third because they think it doesn't mean anything. And don't even get me started on the Fourth Amendment in ICE operations today in Maine. We'll get back to that. Maybe we can talk about that next week. The Fourth Amendment in Maine. Why the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply in the state of Maine, I think, is a heartbreaker. So here's my point. The War Powers Resolution, in its absence, the president would not be able to declare war, to prosecute war without a declaration from Congress. Congress, fully aware of this in 1973 and pissed off at Nixon for having done it anyway, passes federal statute to say you got to cut it out in 60 days. It was enacted because they were mad at the White House taking too much power. They were trying to limit the power further. And now the irony is that administrations, by the way, for decades, Trump didn't invent this, he's just exaggerated it. Administrations for decades have pointed to it and say, well, I've got 60 days, as though saying that the War Powers Resolution gave them more authority than they otherwise would have had. In other words, things were tighter than the law meant to tighten it. right? Things were tighter before the law that was meant to tighten it. That's what I mean by it's analogous to the Bill of Rights. People try to tighten it up, and then inadvertently people point to that and say, well, you didn't say, you didn't double cross your fingers. You didn't say Simon Says. And so we have 60 days. No, that's not what it means. The War Powers Resolution means if you illegally start a war, you have to cut it out in 60
Yeah, it was
days.
more of a you have 60 days to fix it as opposed to
To cut
yeah.
it out. If you did something illegal, you've got 60 days to cut it out. And they never should have. We know now, we didn't know at the time. We know now they shouldn't have passed it because people think that means that it's legal for the 60 days. No, it doesn't suddenly become legal because you're told to cut it out in 60 days.
Yeah, that's actually a good analogy. I'm glad.
You
Yeah,
like that
I think you
analogy.
should.
I'll use it again, but it took me 3 minutes to say it, so I
You,
got to
you got to work on the
streamline it.
delivery, but the the analogy itself is nice. You should break that out more often. But having said that, I think it's a good segue into the passing of Senator Lindsey Graham. So he
Yeah.
passed away Monday, I believe. He was 71. Came after a sudden illness initially. Then it became reported that it was a aortic dissection, I believe. And basically, it's something that once you feel the symptoms of it, you got to get in there real quick, or else
It's virtually too
it's virtually
late.
too late. But
And
you know,
his family has our sympathy. I'm sorry to see him go because, in a number of ways, he was a lot of fun. I think that he was not necessarily good for our politics in certain ways, and we should probably get into that. But I got the impression that he wanted what's best for America. I would suggest that plenty of times we disagreed about what that was, um, but I hope that his family finds peace in his absence.
well said. Because I think we can separate, the tragedy of his passing from his politics.
Yeah, you can still be mad at him for
Right.
politics,
And I
right?
kind of view, from what I understand, he was a veteran. I don't think he saw action. He was in the JAG office for his service, and in some ways, comparing him to John McCain. Of course, John McCain was, depending on your point of view, but within the Republican Party, he was certainly a Republican. He was a war hawk. Uh, you could say the same about Graham. I personally don't think Graham had much conviction about anything other than his hawkish position. The reason I say that is famously he was extremely anti-Trump, called him a clown, thought anybody would be a better president,
Call him a
called him
bigot.
a bigot, a lot of horrible stuff.
Did not have the temperament to be commander
Yeah,
in
which
chief.
ironically in his eulogy, not formal eulogy, but when he was making the talk show rounds and the morning news rounds, President Trump was more than happy to bring up that in essence Graham butted heads with him politically and lost. But having said that,
And John, just to emphasize what you just said, Graham refused to attend the Cleveland 2016 Republican National Convention because he couldn't support Donald Trump. And then
his
becomes
one of his closest confidants in the Senate, and I think that's what.
and political
Yeah, yeah, and I
supporters.
wanted to, in some ways, he's the older version of Vance. Uh, in that Vance also started out very anti-Trump, then saw a political pathway and took it. And I would venture to say that um, Graham did the same thing. That he said, "Hey, I've been in the Senate forever. If I want to stay in the Senate forever, I got to ride these coattails." And aside from the political machinations and the political benefit of, all of a sudden becoming a Trump sycophant, was that he was also very skilled, from what I've read, in traveling between the neocon world and the MAGA world. So when you're talking about someone who, in theory, every MAGA Republican, every America First Republican should have disdain for, it would have been Graham. Here he is in a seat of
Yeah.
power, very influential, all those years in the Senate, and very pro-Ukraine, very pro-Israel. He's been talking about attacking Iran for at least, Mike, 25, 30 years. Like,
Oh, since there was an Iran,
right. He
right?
just was always.
I think he was in middle school when he thought it was a good
And
idea.
certainly
Yeah.
politically, he staked a lot on that. So, from the perspective of
And always pro-war. Pro-war may be an overstatement. From a libertarian point of view, we say that's pro-war. But to your point, always
yeah,
military hawk.
super military hawk, there's no doubt about that. So, Mike, let me tee it up for you and tell me what you think. Senator Graham passed away. The governor of South Carolina announced that his sister will fill out the rest of his term. Graham's
Graham's
sister, yes,
sister.
to be clear.
Yeah, McMaster, the governor, appointed
Uh,
Graham's
uh,
sister.
I forget her name, Nardone Graham. I forget.
Yeah, Graham Nardone. She's going to ride out the term
Right,
until
and we all know
January.
that that's like a joke appointment. That's just meant to be a sure yes vote for the president, right?
Yeah.
She has no.
Although I have to say, there are those, I never met her, I don't know anything about her, right? But there are those who say that she's not an nincompoop. I want to stand up for her independent, not her independent, that's the wrong word, but she is alleged to be a grown
Right,
ass
but I
adult.
meant in terms of she's never held elected office, nothing political in her career.
Right,
So from
right.
that perspective, she's just
And importantly, is expected not to
right.
run in
So
the
there's
primary.
political reasons for just putting, if I can be so impolite, they needed a patsy in that seat, and that's what they got.
Yeah, they need someone who's willing to do their few months, not up in the apple cart, not run for office, not take on the party or the administration.
Get out and make room probably for McMaster to run himself. But that being said,
Or someone else that McMaster likes, or someone else that Trump likes.
Graham, who passed away, who was not just a big influential vote in the Senate, had plenty of seniority with which his sister will not inherit, right? It doesn't work that way, right? So that spot rotates to
Right.
somebody else,
He's
right?
just there to vote. Right.
Mitch McConnell, which we haven't gotten into depth about, but let's just say there's
Who is allegedly still alive. We saw a picture
allegedly
of him
still alive, but
today.
the point is he's not in the Senate. He's not doing his job. He's been missing.
And the 911 recording says that they were doing CPR. So take it from someone who lost, I'm told 9 of the 11 people on whom I did CPR didn't make it, possibly because I suck at it, right? But also because
It's serious.
thank you.
It's not I
Yeah.
caught a cold. It's a serious occurrence, and to the effect that
Yeah.
Senator McConnell's still alive, we're happy. But the point is, that's two supporters that the president and the Senate clearly their President Senator Graham passed away. Mitch McConnell's been not present really, and certainly not the influential vote he was.
And he can't vote unless he's physically there in the Senate. There's no remote voting in the Senate. So the Senate is effectively
To
down to
well,
52-47 Republican Democratic
once the
split at
sister
the
gets
moment.
there, yeah.
Yeah, once the
Right.
sister gets there.
So
Otherwise, they're at
right,
51.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you politically, first of all, and then as specific to the war. Is this a net political positive for the president? Not to be too cold about it, but McConnell and Graham were not favorites of the America First movement. Steve Bannon had all sorts of
Yeah.
horrible things to say about Graham. He doesn't have many good things to say about McConnell. A lot of the America First people are not fans of McConnell, and we're not fans of Graham. Do you think this is a net positive? Let's break it out for the president and then for the MAGA
Yeah, it
movement
is.
specifically.
Yeah, it is for both, but not much in the sense that McConnell is leaving anyway. right? McConnell is leaving in January anyway. The fact that he may be out sick for 8 months early is a problem vote-wise. I think at this point, the rumor is that he's going to come back. Boy, that strikes me as an uphill climb, given the severity of what must apparently be his condition, his age, right? And we all project ourselves into these situations, right? I mean, let's be honest. If it were you, or if it were me, well, I won't speak for you. If it were me, if I'm his age and I'm that sick, which for me, I'm thankful to say is multiple decades
with
plus from
absence
now.
seizures.
But
I mean, we've had documented absence
yeah,
seizures, so
yeah, I mean, he wasn't well before this episode, right? So, if it me, I'm saying, you know what? Mitch out. You all get someone else's sister. You know, does Lindsey have another sister to take my place? But he's out either way. So this isn't a big deal to the president unless he really has a tough vote over the next few months, which ain't impossible, as we know. But I think that this is not going to be a big. We'll see, but I don't think it's going to be a big deal. Graham, yes, it's a net positive because Trump is going to be able to replace Graham with someone he wants. We learned in Kentucky 4 that the president can get his way in terms of replacing Thomas Massie, right? Replacing a Republican with someone who is another Republican, but instead of voting with him 90% of the time, in Massie's case, someone who will vote with him 100% of the time. So marginally a win for the
well,
president.
do you see? I mean, we've counted him out before, and he's proven remarkably resilient. I mean, the president in terms of his influence. But again, we're now, especially after the midterms, we're going to be clearly in lame duck status if we're not already to some extent.
And let me jump in real quick for the sake of folks listening who don't have extra time to pay attention to, all of these anal retentive facts. The primary in South Carolina to replace Lindsey will come before the
Exactly.
midterm.
By South Carolina law, you get 1 week to grieve, in essence, to pick the replacement, and then from that moment, you have to have a special election 1 month after. You know, so basically,
Right. So whatever juice Trump is going to lose in November, he will not have lost yet by the time of that primary.
exactly. So the question becomes, um, is the Republican Party that hopefully is positioning for life after President Trump's exit from office, and if you're a conspiracy guy, assuming he exits office when the Constitution says he should, um, is the Republican Party going to try to hold on to this America First? And I know this is a question that's up your alley. This America First nationalistic thing, or do you see the more traditional wing of the Republican Party or some other wing of the Republican Party trying to use this as an opportunity to try to claw back, let's face it, the GOP away from the MAGA and the America First?
I think it is a question that does not get answered but for two things: the passage of time. Having said that, I will give you a prediction, and splintering all those definitions. In other words, I think Republicanism, Trumpism, MAGA, and America First are four different things. MAGA and Trump are mad at each other sometimes because MAGA is all about America First foreign policy, which means avoiding war and means disclosure of Epstein files and a number of other things, right? So MAGA and Trumpism are no longer the same thing. Now, the president asserts they're definitionally identical. But if you define MAGA as supported Trump on the way in, you're still looking for your Epstein disclosure and your anti-war stance, right? And traditional Republicanism is overlaps with those two a little bit, right? But if you were to consider old-fashioned Republicanism, I think you've got to say it's a combination of getting back to the basics of fiscal conservatism, a little bit of constitutionalism, but would be very neoconservative foreign policy, right? Would be the Lindsey Graham and John McCain foreign policy. So so that doesn't overlap with perfectly with any of the categories. And I do believe that the direction this is going to be going in, I hope this doesn't sound completely self-serving. I will be honest with you, though. I think it's going to come in my direction, meaning a little here and a little there with a big libertarian streak. In other words, where I think it's going is less war. Now, you can call that America first if you want, but more free markets, which people don't like to include in America first. See, it's all, what you choose. But I think it's going to move toward free markets, less war, more constitutional adherence, which means okay to close the border, gain control of the border, not okay to go killing people and pretending they were trying to run you over with a car. Right? Those two things need to be parsed out. And as far as MAGA goes, it's going to go in the direction of, yeah, we want our Epstein disclosures,
Right.
right? And do we support Trump? Yeah, when he gets it right. And when he doesn't, no. I think that's where in other words, the party is going to move in what I would call a combination of rationality and liberty. It's going to move toward the Constitution, fiscal conservatism, free markets, less war, and more transparency, which I don't want this to be a commercial, is why I believe so strongly in the idea that, as an example, people are going to reject the old-fashioned way we choose vice presidents. One guy deciding and everyone else just has to go, oh, that was a good idea. That's going to go by the
Right.
wayside. A whole bunch of weird things that we've done are going to go by the wayside. I eventually think, for example, there's going to be pushback, just like there was against Nixon. There's going to be pushback against one guy deciding
Or to take us
we
off
can
the
go to
gold
war.
standard. Nixon's,
Or take us
yeah,
off the gold standard, or charge a
right,
toll in the Strait of
right.
Hormuz, or a lot of these goofy things. I think there's going to be pushback, not only from a policy angle, because some of these are just not good policies, but from a power concentration angle.
And I'm going to end on the next one, Mike, because I want on this next question, because you mentioned the power angle. A lot of what I've read, a lot of what I've heard is that in some weird way, Senator Graham, and I know it's tough for people like me to accept, somehow kept a check on President Trump, somehow kept him closer to what you and I might call traditional Republican policies and traditional Republican positioning, right? Um, President Trump himself said there was a lot of times I wanted to do something, but I got talked out of it by Senator Graham. And he also said that there were things that Senator Graham wanted to do that I talked him out of. In other words, it seemed like he, Senator Graham had a huge influence on President Trump behind the scenes. And certainly, look, right up until he died, I think Senator Graham had just returned from the Ukraine. He was still advocating for supporting the Ukraine. So he got the president to kind of do what he
Yep.
wanted with Iran, but not so much with the Ukraine. And of course, he was very pro-Israel, Senator Graham, which kind of goes with anyway. So
Yep.
is there, you think, the chance that the opposite might happen without Lindsey Graham, as much as I would hate to give him credit for this? Do you think with Senator Graham gone, do you think there's one major voice of quote unquote reason, again open to debate, is now absent from President Trump's circle?
Yeah, I do. I think that that's an important point. I don't know. Uh, One senator, I don't know how important that is, because President Trump does not. Yeah, I agree. I agree. But I think that the only reason he was an advisor is because he was a senator. In other words, Trump respects power per se, which is why he doesn't listen to staff, right? And I think, you know, people say he listens to Rubio. People say he listens to Vance. We don't know the extent to which that's true. We don't know the extent to which that's important. But the only reason he would listen to those two guys is because they were former senators and because they're powerful people with their own political bases. I doubt he would listen, President Trump would listen, for example, to someone like Henry Kissinger. I doubt he would listen to someone like Zib Brzezinski, these very smart foreign-born secretaries of state that other presidents put so much stock in. I doubt that he would listen to his own national security advisor. What's his name? Who he's prosecuting, right, from the first term. What's his name? Yeah, John Bolton. Whom I've met. There's no love lost there. The guy's kind of a putz, but there's no getting around the fact that he's smart, right? Trump had no problem getting rid of him, no problem prosecuting him. These are people that didn't have their own independent power. He respects power per se. That's why he respects so much these international leaders who are domestic strongmen in their own nations, right? He has every willingness to cut him some slack. It's why he goes out of his way to say he's got a good relationship with Putin. He's got a good relationship with Xi, because these are strong, powerful people, and he revels in those relationships. And I think that's why he listened to Graham. And with all due respect to Senator Graham, you would not say that the reason you were listening to him is because he had an unparalleled intellect, right? And one of the reasons that people like Graham is because he was sort of a normal guy. He had unusual experiences, but he came across as being sort of a normal guy. But Trump listens to him because he's a
I grant you
senator.
that, Mike, but do you think the absence of Graham's influence, whatever the reason,
Yeah, is a bad
tell
thing
me
for the White House.
give me, if you can, a potential thing. Like, do you think that Graham not being there means what? Because we're already
Means a Trumper will replace him, someone who is per se a Trump supporter. In other words, if Trump, right now the word is it's not going to be McMaster. But if it is McMaster, it'll only be because Trump decided that McMaster is a Trump supporter, right? He's not going to having come off the Massey episode, Trump is not going to make the mistake of supporting someone and then hoping that they're a Trump supporter. Whoever it is going to be a Trump supporter. And the expectation will be that they vote with the White House 100% of the time. And as soon as they step out of line, they'll be politically crushed, more so than someone else would if they stepped out of line because of this expectation. So that will be, what I'm trying to say is it'll be a bad thing for governance, but it'll be a good thing if you're President Trump and just want power to have your own
yeah, I
person in
meant
that
more
seat.
like now that Graham isn't going to be occupying any space buzzing in Trump's ear. Is there someone you think other than Graham that kind of rotates up to that spout? In other words, it was often said that, and even Trump admitted this, that he'd get calls from Graham at all times a day and in the morning, and he would have to
Yeah.
take the call and listen to him. And then, he said on Fox the other day, I heard him. He goes,
Yeah.
I had to put Senator Graham on straight to voicemail because he keeps calling me about stuff. So do you,
Yeah, probably someone does step up and fills that role. Let's hope that it's someone who's less of a war hawk. I'm sure that Graham's time gets dispersed among a whole
do you feel
bunch of
there's somebody
people.
who could
They may,
that either you've heard of or is rumored to be someone who's next in line for that spot?
no, no, there are no. I'm hopeful that people who are already in the orbit and who the most rational. You know, uh, there are certain people we don't spend much time talking about. Um, I got one. The president's son-in-law. Really, because Jared Kushner is one of those guys that we started out making fun of. Let's be honest. I made fun of the idea of him having so much influence in the White House because he didn't have a lot of experience in the public sector, blah, blah, blah. He has proven himself a deft operator, both politically and internationally in terms of understanding
Well,
finance is his wheelhouse, but
financially,
understanding
absolutely, yeah.
economics. Yeah. So no surprise there. But he's been plugged in. His dad, his family had plugged him in for a generation leading up to this point. I just mean, I don't mean like, oh, I hope Jared becomes, really important. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying there are examples of people in the president's orbit who are smart, who are capable, who don't get the juice that they deserve because they don't have their own independent political basis. Will some people like that naturally get more of the president's ear?
Mm.
Maybe.
It'll be interesting how it plays out because I think, like we said, it's going to be very important. I think even less so in terms of the actual vote that Graham held. Like you said, that's a Trump vote. It's going to stay a Trump vote for the foreseeable future. I'm saying more in terms of influence within the White House. I think it'll be interesting to
Yeah.
see how that plays out, to see how it affects the prosecution of this war. Like you said, we're already positioning ourselves like it's less rah-rah and it's more just whatever Norman Vincent Peale put in the president's head about positive thinking. I think that's what's going on right now. So
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever Trump says is what the policy is
yeah, that's
today
always hard to
at
know.
this point.
All right, Mike, before we end, we want to remind everyone to like and subscribe, of course. It really helps us out with the algorithm, but we also want to I want to let you say to this mission of yours to become vice president of the United States for the Republican Party. If folks want to learn more about that, if they want to help out in some way, where can they go?
Go to MikeTermott.com, which is tricky because you got to spell it right. You got to spell Termott with two A's. But if you go to MikeTermott.com, you can learn all kinds of things. Reach out to me at Mike@MikeTermott.com. I think my phone number is probably out there as well. Feel free to ping me. And let's recognize, the campaign that we are running for the Republican Party's nomination for vice president is going to do a couple of things besides just push that narrow concept. It's going to empower national delegates to take matters into their own hands and select the vice presidential nominee rather than just merely deferring to the presidential nominee and abdicating their true authority and responsibility. Number one, I think that's going to happen over the next 10 and 20 years, whether we push it or not. I'm just trying to accelerate it. And number two, we want to unify the Republican Party for the good of the party and for the good of America, but for the good of the party. We want someone from the Liberty Movement to be included in the national ticket. That's the direction the party is going to go. It's the direction the party has to go. It's the direction young people are going. It's the direction we have to go to bring young people into the Republican Party. So it's going to be good for the GOP, and that's a big piece of what this is all about.
Fantastic. So everyone go to MikeTermott.com and check out what Mike is up to there. All right, everyone, until next time, this is Big John from my friend and co-host, Mr. Mike Termott. We'll see you again next week. Peace, everyone.